The success of the theater dome and the innovative stage lighting led the German electric company AEG to produce and sell Fortuny's stage lighting system. And for industrial designers, this is a fascinating little moment because it connects Fortuny, who's usually not thought of as an industrial designer, to Peter Behrens, who's considered one of the greatest early industrial designers. So that's a story for another time, but the link between innovation in Italy in 1900 and innovation in Germany in 1900 and the use of electricity is a really interesting and lively one. So the lighting system became commercially available as a product, as a lighting system, and as a result installed in theaters throughout Europe. All theaters were struggling with the same problems, that new electric lighting couldn't really be harnessed in a way that made better stage scenery, and Fortuny figured that out, and the AEG sort of packaged it and sold it. Fortuny also developed a number of lamps using his early innovation of achieving even reflected light. Remember that in 1907, it's still very early to be producing electric light fixtures, and there was no real system for or consensus on what electric devices should look like. But I would say by any standards, this Fortuny floor lamp is a radical and modern-looking object for 1907. The light it produced was so superior to other lamps that it existed beyond the concerns of aesthetics. This floor lamp works the same way as the Fortuny dome in that it uses reflected light. There's a bright light source shining, instead of out at the room, it's shining into the dome. It's shining into a parabolic reflector and sent out in a more even reflected way. Today this looks like a designed lamp to us, but in 1907, to have no applied decoration on an object intended for domestic use was pretty radical. Fortuny also developed versions of this lamp. There was a ceiling lamp. This is the table lamp. If someone asked me to date this lamp just looking at the forms, I would have to say it's Art Deco. It's got smooth, undecorated, concentric forms that look machine-made, and in fact, it predates that. It's 1907. Fortuny lamps are still made today, and for me that's a real sign of successful innovation, that 100 years later, a design could still be compelling. The construction details are different now, but the overall form and the way the lamp works are all the same. We also need to know that Fortuny was interested in photography at a time when photography was still a very complicated undertaking, and an enthusiast would have to be part artist and part chemist to prepare all of the chemicals and surfaces needed. Throughout his career, he used photography to record the world around him and to sort of sketch for artistic purposes. On the left is a self-portrait from 1890, and on the right, a portrait of Henriette Negrin from 1905. She was his muse from 1897 on. He met her in Paris, and she was his business partner from around 1904 on, and his wife from 1918 on. As a side note, she's sort of central to the story. She inspired Fortuny throughout his career, but she also worked alongside him, participating in all of the later fabric and clothing production. She had been working as an artist model for student painters in Paris when they met in 1897, and she moved to Venice in 1902, although they didn't marry for years because his family didn't really approve of the union. He photographed and painted her many, many times throughout their long relationship, and it's pretty rare and remarkable to see such intimate and beautifully painted portraits throughout someone's entire life. You watch her age as you look at the portraits. In addition to photography, etching challenged Fortuny's interest in technical art forms. He was fascinated by the complexities of producing images on metal using different techniques. The Fortuny story gets really interesting when he starts to combine all of his interests together. So his ability to produce even bright electric light could, he realized, allow him to take techniques that he knew from photography and techniques that he knew from printing and apply them to fabric. He would soak silks in a gelatin, on top of which he would outline a design with a chemical solution, either manually or photographically, and exposing that gelatin to light hardens the chemicals to work as a resist that can then be washed off after printing and dyeing. So it's resist printing, but using modern technologies. And as a result, panels of fabric became canvases for Fortuny's complex and evocative patterns. Fortuny's early textile investigations led him to produce his earliest apparel, the Knossos scarves, which were large, lightweight scarves with rich patterns. In 1912, Vogue published an article called The Robes of Fortuny, written by Marguerite O'Kane, and she wrote, "Mr. Fortuny is not a couturier. He is primarily, in the dressmaking world, a creator of fabrics. He takes a piece of unfurred cloth, chiffon, lawn, crepe, what you will, and paints or stencils upon it a design of such rare beauty that it would be a sacrilege to consider further decoration." Fortuny also developed hardware that would allow the Knossos scarf to be joined at the shoulder and worn as a sort of overgarment. The Vogue article continued, "The materials used are of a curious Eastern texture, which is woven to the order of the artist. These extraordinary stuffs, inwrought with gold that appears dim with age, and deft patterns in strange tones of greys, browns, blues, and greens, seem indeed relics of primitive magnificence." And if you remember the picture of his father's studio, that makes a perfect sort of sense. Here are pictures of some different ways the scarves could be worn, using some of the hardware that he developed. Fortuny continued his textile investigations by experimenting with how his techniques could transform velvet. Using processes that can be aided by bright, even light to transfer patterns onto velvet, he arrived at very complicated burnout or dévoré patterns. And they perfectly suit his interest in complex, exotic patterns, in fabric printing, and engraving and lighting technology. He got all of those to come together to make these remarkable velvets. And once able to produce large squares of patterned fabric, he had to start figuring out what they could become. And he started by turning the panels into clothing. They were simple silhouettes that celebrated the textiles more than they did any particular style of fashion. But they all succeed with a sort of nod to ancient clothing types.